Beneath the veneer of southern charm, Little Rock bleeds spectral secrets. Forget history, the past here isn't recorded. It hunts. Prepare for a chilling descent into the shadows of the Capitol and forgotten mansions. This is the definitive countdown. The top 15 haunted places in Little Rock. Arkansas. 1. The Empress of Little Rock, Hornibrook Mansion. Little Rock, the Hornibrook Mansion, now known with ironic reverence as the Empress of Little Rock, stands as a confection of Victorian ambition frozen against the humid Arkansas sky. Its elaborate Queen Anne architecture, all turrets and gables, suggests 19th century opulence, but the atmosphere inside is thick with historical tragedy. Like perfume turned stale, visitors often mistake the pervasive, deep chill that grips the grand foyer for mere air conditioning, but experienced staff recognize it as the thermal signature of something older and far more proprietary than any living owner. The history here is less about real estate transactions and more about sudden, violent departures. Constructed in 1888 for James H. Hornibrook, the home quickly established a reputation for drama exceeding its aesthetic flair. Local lore centers on the deaths that plagued the family and later occupants. Most persistent is the story of a man who, overwhelmed by either debt or despair, allegedly took his life by leaping from the third-floor balcony overlooking the garden. This event, coupled with whispered accounts of a maid falling or being pushed down the intricate main staircase, seems to have permanently imprinted a residual fear onto the structure's very foundation. The house accepted the opulence, but demanded a steep price in human suffering. The resulting disturbances are not subtle. Guests report waking in the night to the distinct, hollow sound of heavy footsteps pacing relentlessly above the unoccupied third floor, particularly near the cupola where the air pressure seems to fluctuate wildly. Mirrors throughout the upper levels are notorious for capturing quick, fleeting shadows that move too deliberately to be reflections. In the dining room, small objects occasionally slide across mahogany tables in silent defiance of gravity. However, the most unnerving manifestation is the unseen musician. Staff have repeatedly heard an antique piano playing complex, melancholic ragtime emanating from the closed parlor, only to find the room empty and the instrument's lid sealed upon investigation. To stay at the Empress is not to visit a historic building. It is to interrupt a very long, very unhappy conversation between the dead. The entities within the Hornibrook do not simply reside here. They control the temperature, the soundscape, and the lingering sense that any living soul entering their space is merely a temporary, noisy guest in a grand structure built only for permanent, spectral residence. 2. Old State House Museum, Little Rock. The damp chill of the Arkansas night always seems to settle deepest within the granite walls of the Old State House Museum. Built in 1833, it stands sentinel over Little Rock, a monument burdened not just by history, but by the echoes of tumultuous governance, civil war, and the bloody confrontations that stained its original role as the seat of state power. Visitors often remark on the heavy silence that permeates the legislative chambers, but those who work the late shift know it is not silence, but a profound, expectant stillness. The legend most discussed among security staff concerns the phantom of a Confederate soldier, perpetually searching for his lost commander. The building briefly served as a hospital during the occupation of Little Rock, and the suffering endured here imprinted itself permanently onto the structure's ethereal memory. However, the most active and most unsettling presence is tied directly to the political violence of Reconstruction. In 1874, during the chaotic Brooks-Baxter War, the Speaker of the House, John McClure, was shot in the very hallway outside the main legislative floor. He died agonizingly a few days later, and his presence never fully departed. McClure is the entity responsible for the most intense physical manifestations. Custodians frequently report finding objects including heavy antique gavels and stacks of official documents, inexplicably thrown from desks in the locked speaker's office. The sound of a single, echoing gunshot followed by a heavy, dragging thud has been reported dozens of times near the second-floor stairwell, always when the building is otherwise empty. On occasion, the building's sensitive motion alarms are triggered by a disturbance too slow and deliberate to be a rat, a figure captured fleetingly on thermal cameras, dressed in clothing decades out of date. The curators maintain the museum's integrity, keeping the history accessible, but they cannot scrub away the residual terror. When the last lights are extinguished and the ancient doors are secured, the old state house becomes a mausoleum of unresolved conflict. The air thins around the spot where McClure fell, and a palpable cold spot drifts, a testament to the fact that some legislative sessions, once adjourned by death, never truly close. Three, Mount Holly Cemetery, Little Rock. The air inside Mount Holly Cemetery in Little Rock hangs perpetually heavy, saturated with the history of Arkansas's elite governors, senators, and Confederate generals resting beneath crumbling Gothic mausoleums and soaring Victorian monuments. This Westminster Abbey of Arkansas is beautiful in daylight, but by the failing light of the humid southern dusk, the wrought iron fences seem to close in, trapping the echoes of the Civil War era and the unresolved sorrow of the dead. It is not the famous occupants, however, but the children and forgotten souls who truly anchor the cemetery's spectral reputation. One persistent, heartrending legend concerns the sound of a phantom lullaby. Visitors and security patrols report hearing a faint, wavering tune drifting near the plot of a young girl named Anne, who died suddenly in the late 1800s. The melody, described as mournful and profoundly sad, seems to emanate from the ground itself, occasionally accompanied by the distinct smell of dried lavender, a scent often used in grave blankets during the period. Those who follow the sound often find themselves standing before Anne's modest marble marker, the lullaby abruptly cutting off, leaving an intense, shivering cold despite the summer night. The most unnerving manifestation involves the cemetery's central path. Witnesses, including off-duty police officers who patrol the area, have sighted a shadow figure tall and impossibly thin, drifting rapidly between the monuments, appearing to search frantically among the older sections. This figure is believed to be the spirit of a heartbroken mother looking for her infant son, who was moved to an unmarked pauper's grave during a catastrophic yellow fever outbreak. If approached or called out to, the figure simply dissolves, leaving behind a brief, guttural cry that sounds less like a human scream and more like tearing cloth. Mount Holly does not merely house the dead, it holds their grief captive. After the last tourist has left and the gates are locked, the stillness is broken by inexplicable weeping, the rustling of silks where no one walks, and the suffocating pressure of being watched by those who died too young or were simply buried in the wrong place. The only certainty is that their long, cold watch continues, deep within the consecrated soil of Little Rock. Four, Macarthur Museum of Arkansas Military History, Little Rock. The air inside the old barracks at the Macarthur Museum always carries the scent of dust and distant gunpowder, a heavy, still quality that clings to the uniforms under glass. Even during the day, the shadows pool deep in the corners of the upper floors, where the original building materials absorb the light, and perhaps the lingering echoes of those who passed through its doors during times of war. This building, originally the Little Rock Arsenal, bore witness to the shifting loyalties of the Civil War and the agonizing weight of soldiers preparing for deployment in conflicts ranging from the World Wars to Vietnam. The most persistent legend concerns a young officer, Captain Elias Thorne, whose portrait hangs discreetly near the museum director's office. Thorne reportedly committed suicide in the arsenal's upper chambers in 1863 after receiving news of a devastating defeat. Or perhaps, according to some staff whispers, after a severe moral failure he could not reconcile. His spirit, they say, remains tethered to the place of his despair, a silent sentinel of regret. The hauntings are subtle but deeply disturbing. Curators working alone late at night often report the sudden, profound drop in temperature near the old stairwell, accompanied by the distinct, rhythmic creak of leather boots on the uncarpeted floor above. Items within locked glass displays sometimes shift a bayonet rotated slightly, or a campaign medal inexplicably face down. The most terrifying accounts involve the persistent feeling of being watched from behind, only to turn and see the indistinct, fleeting image of a man in 19th century uniform standing in the gallery entrance, his face obscured by shadow and profound exhaustion. One cold January evening, a security guard found the door to the Civil War gallery locked from the inside, though he knew he had secured it hours earlier. Through the glass, he saw the portrait of Captain Thorne, now slightly askew. As he fumbled with his keys, a deep, mournful sigh seemed to emanate directly from the wall, a sound not of wind, but of eternal, cold resignation, locking the memory of his failure perpetually within the historic stone walls. Five, Capitol Hotel, Little Rock. The chandeliers of the Capitol Hotel, draped in an amber glow that barely pierced the humid Little Rock darkness, often seemed to hold their breath. Built in 1870, the grand edifice has weathered over a century of political machinations, societal shifts, and, allegedly, something far more sinister. The opulent facade belies a deeper, colder history rooted in the tragic demise of a young girl whose spirit is said to remain eternally lodged within the velvet and mahogany of the structure. Legend holds that during the hotel's early years, a small child, some say a relative of the original owner, tumbled to her death down the grand staircase, breaking her neck on the polished marble below. Her presence is a persistent, if ethereal, fixture. Staff and long-term guests report an inexplicable feeling of being watched near the atrium, often accompanied by the distinct, fleeting scent of antique lavender and baby powder. The true epicenter of the haunting, however, is the fourth floor, particularly rooms 412 and 415, which are often left vacant due to consistent, low-level paranormal activity. Guests checking into these rooms often complain of lights flickering on and off entirely by themselves, or televisions suddenly changing channels in the middle of the night. Cleaners sometimes find toys or small, childish trinkets that were not present minutes before, only for them to vanish entirely upon a second glance. The most unnerving manifestation is the sound, a quiet, rhythmic thumping, like a tiny hand lightly tapping against the interior of a wall, always seeming to move just out of reach. One engineer, investigating a supposed structural issue, swore he heard a child's faint, distressed giggle emanating from within the ventilation shaft itself. The hotel meticulously maintains its stately appearance, yet the chill remains, a spectral resident who never checked out. When the late-night silence settles over the lobby and the antique clock chimes 2 a.m, the heavy air seems to compress, and the faint, sweet smell of baby powder drifts down the grand staircase, reminding those present that while the living may leave, the smallest, most tragic of the Capitol's past inhabitants is still playing in the shadows. 6. Curran Hall, Little Rock. The humidity of Little Rock settles around Curran Hall, a pristine antebellum structure that seems perpetually frozen in the soft, melancholic light of the 1840s. The air here is heavy, not just with summer heat, but with the quiet expectation that precedes a long-delayed revelation, though now restored as a vital piece of the city's historical district. The preserved clapboard walls and deep porch columns serve as a deceptive facade for the cold, persistent activity within. Built in 1839 by Colonel John Curran, The house witnessed the transition of Arkansas from a new frontier into a state marked by civil unrest and profound societal shifts. Local lore suggests that the house carries the deep sorrow of the Curran family, particularly a spectral woman often identified as a daughter who succumbed to illness shortly before the war. Her presence is not violent, but rather a chilling manifestation of profound, unmoving grief. Trapped within the confines of the period architecture she adored and the life she was never allowed to live fully, staff and historical society volunteers report specific, undeniable phenomena concentrated in the parlor and the second-floor master bedroom. Guests have described sudden, extreme drops in temperature, accompanied by the distinct scent of dried lavender and the faint, rhythmic creak of an empty rocking chair. On several occasions, security cameras have recorded faint, white vapor coalescing near the antique mirrors, briefly resolving into the silhouette of a woman in a high-necked gown before dissipating. These encounters are often accompanied by the sound of muffled weeping, always seeming to originate just beyond the locked doors of the upper floor, regardless of whether the building is occupied or secured for the night. Curran Hall operates as a museum of history, yet its deepest exhibit is the residual pain that refuses to vacate the premises. It is a place where the past is not just displayed behind velvet ropes, but actively endures, ensuring that the quiet tragedy of one 19th century spirit is reenacted for every generation that dares to listen for the sound of her unending sorrow echoing through the historic halls. Seven, Arkansas State Capitol, Little Rock. The polished marble of the Arkansas State Capitol reflects the midnight security lights like black ice. In the echoing expanse of the rotunda, the air pressure often drops without warning, a deep, pervasive cold that has nothing to do with the thermostat settings. Night supervisors are accustomed to the sound of keys jingling in empty halls and the faint, wet sound of coughing carried on air currents in wings where no one has worked since dusk. The building is an architectural marvel of limestone and granite, but its foundation rests not just on bedrock, but on a century of silent suffering and the palpable weight of the historical narrative. The legend underpinning the Capitol's oppressive atmosphere traces back to its contentious construction around the turn of the 20th century. Hundreds of inmates were utilized for the grueling labor, hauling tons of stone and working the quarries under notoriously harsh conditions. Historical documentation suggests the work detail was brutal, marred by high mortality rates, accidental deaths, and summary violence. It was a system designed to extract labor until the laborer collapsed. The persistent belief among old Arkansas historians is that the Capitol is a mausoleum built of forced hands, their desperate, trapped energy forever infused into the very structural integrity of the place. Those who died on site, unmourned and unrecorded, are rumored to still clock in for their eternal shift. The manifestations are subtle but persistent. Staff report doors swinging inward in the locked Senate chambers, where a gaunt, dark silhouette is occasionally seen slumping in a chair near the dais. More chilling are the lower levels and utility tunnels beneath the main structure, where the residual hauntings are strongest. Witnesses have reported hearing the unmistakable scraping sound of heavy shackles being dragged across the concrete, usually accompanied by a sudden, intense wave of profound despair and fatigue. It is not the grand apparition of a historical figure that chills the bone, but the relentless, mournful presence of the forgotten laborer. A silent army of specters, eternally trapped beneath the majestic white dome of the state they were forced to build. 8. Historic Arkansas Museum, Little Rock. The air within the cluster of restored 19th century buildings at the historic Arkansas Museum holds a stillness deeper than preservation. Gaslight cast long, deceptive shadows across rough-hewn timbers and narrow doorways. These structures, relocated and meticulously maintained, are not merely historical exhibits. They are sealed containers for the anxieties and resentments of Little Rock's earliest days. The transition from the noise of modern traffic outside to the heavy, chilled silence of the interior courtyard is jarring. An immediate chronological displacement felt most intensely after the museum closes and the heavy silence settles over the block. The oldest of these buildings date back to the 1820s and 1830s, chronicling a period of brutal frontier living. The Hinderlater Grog Shop, in particular, was a crucible of volatile behavior, a place where debts were often settled with fists or knives, and where the damp of the Arkansas River often brought sickness that claimed the vulnerable. It is this specific emotional residue, the low thrum of desperate conversation and the heavy air of alcoholic rage, that seems etched into the wood itself, refusing to dissipate with time. Curators frequently report an unnerving pressure change and sudden drops in temperature near the original Hinderlater fireplace. Even when the building's environmental systems are stable, the manifestations are subtle but persistent. Late at night, security personnel have logged reports of shuffling footsteps moving across the upstairs floorboards of the former residences, always leading them to entirely empty rooms. The most disturbing recurring incident involves the staff responsible for inventory, small, heavy objects, especially iron ledger weights and brittle documents, are consistently moved from locked display cases and found repositioned on nearby tables. The presence felt is not outright malevolence, but a heavy, crushing sense of proprietary ownership, as if a long-dead merchant or settler is performing a restless, endless audit of their holdings. The ghost stories of the historic Arkansas Museum are less about spectral figures than about enduring atmosphere. They suggest that the preservation effort was too successful, trapping the misery of the past alongside the artifacts. As the old doors lock up for the night, the true exhibit remains the heavy quiet, punctuated only by the occasional, distinct sound of a distant, unseen chair scraping back across the rough floorboards, waiting for the morning's futile attempt to bring order to a property that never truly surrendered its dead. Nine. The Villamar, Little Rock. The air around the Villamar in Little Rock is perpetually heavy, smelling faintly of dust and aged velvet. This Victorian marvel, built in 1881, stands as a testament to Gilded Age extravagance, but its ornate facades mask a profound domestic sorrow. Its current reputation owes less to architectural merit and more to the persistent, chilling presence of its original inhabitants, specifically one unfortunate soul whose suffering seems indelibly pressed into the very structure of the building. The history centers on the tragic figure of Sarah, the wife of the original owner. She was reportedly confined to the master suite after a debilitating illness, dying slowly and in isolation on the third floor. Local legend and historical records confirm that her husband, heartbroken but emotionally distant, never truly moved past her death, though his grief manifested as a cold silence that permeated the house. It is this sorrowful inertia, rooted in the absence of comfort and connection during her final months, that seems to power the majority of the subsequent paranormal activity. The activity is localized and highly specific, suggesting an intelligent, if melancholy, haunting. Guests and historical preservationists frequently report cold spots that aggressively defy the internal thermostat, usually concentrated near the Grand Master Staircase, where Sarah was reportedly carried only once she was near death. The most disturbing phenomena occur in the small, unused sewing room on the second floor. The audible, rhythmic thump of a rocking chair heard when the room is demonstrably empty, and the overwhelming scent of medicinal lavender, a fragrance not used in the building for nearly a century. Occasionally, staff report seeing a faint, dark smudge reflected in the tall, arched windows, a figure perpetually looking out, waiting. Investigative teams have routinely documented electronic voice phenomena, EVP, capturing soft, drawn-out sighs, typically muffled by the sound of weeping. One recording, captured in 2018, seemed to answer a direct query about her state with a single, fragile word: cold. The Villa Marre doesn't scream with terror. It whispers with unending regret. The house remains impeccably maintained, yet it is utterly impossible to feel warm inside, suggesting that Sarah Marre is still waiting for a final, compassionate release that the architecture simply refuses to grant her. Little Rock Central High School, National Historic Site. Little Rock. The heat hung heavy and wet over Little Rock Central High. Not the humid haze of Arkansas summer, but a dense, suffocating blanket of historical dread. It clings particularly to the brickwork flanking the front entrance, where the ghosts of contention and fear remain indelible. After dusk, when the National Historic Site settles into silent, monumental shadow, the true occupants emerge from the archives of memory. The legend isn't of a single tragic suicide, but of collective, residual trauma woven into the very structure during the pivotal fall of 1957. Visitors often mention feeling an oppressive, directed hatred, cold as banked ash, emanating from empty hallways. Security footage anomalies consistently capture fleeting, blurred shapes. Not children, but spectral adults in drab period clothing, standing motionless near the administrative wing, their faces obscured by the shadows of their own fury. They are the spectral agitators, eternally patrolling the grounds they sought to defend from change. One particular janitor, decades ago, refused to work the second floor after 2 a.m. He reported hearing sharp, panicked gasps and the sound of running shoes echoing from the otherwise deserted gymnasium. More disturbingly, he claimed the main staircase, the very steps climbed by the Little Rock Nine, sometimes manifested a chilling, almost electrical charge. One evening, he saw a fleeting projection, a teenage girl, dressed impeccably, frozen halfway up the landing, her face contorted in an expression of absolute, petrified terror. Her silent scream trapped within the historical moment. Tonight, the alarms remain silent. Yet the atmosphere within the empty auditorium vibrates with unheard shouting. If you listen closely at the main gates when the streetlights flicker off, you can hear it, the low, resonant rumble of an invisible crowd, forever gathered outside the perimeter of history. Their spectral resentment a cold draft across the paved paths, waiting for the doors to open again. Oakland Cemetery, Little Rock. The stillness of Oakland Cemetery is a humid, heavy silence, broken only by the distant traffic of Little Rock. Established in 1860, this oldest public cemetery's massive, weather-stained monuments and collapsing iron fences speak not just of history, but of overcrowding. The ground here is perpetually restless. The earliest sections are layered with the remains of Civil War casualties and victims of 19th century epidemics, creating a palpable, archaic pressure that seems to push down on every visitor. It is less a resting place and more a dense city of the dead. Archivists and long-term groundskeepers consistently report phenomena intrinsically tied to the cemetery's most troubled historical periods. The main areas of activity center around the ornate, often dilapidated mausoleums of the Confederate dead, where temperature drops defying the harsh Arkansas heat are routinely documented, sometimes plummeting by 20 degrees in open air. The most disturbing recurring sound is a specific, high-pitched weeping, often recorded near the unmarked plots of those who succumbed to cholera in the 1870s. A sound described as mournful but also profoundly enraged. As if death by disease afforded no dignity, these manifestations are not purely auditory. Security logs detail numerous instances of the main entrance gate, a heavy antique iron structure being discovered firmly locked at dawn after having been manually secured, fully open the previous night. Furthermore, individuals passing the larger family plots have reported fleeting, dark figures that move too quickly to identify, usually accompanied by a sudden, intense smell of decay despite the current, manicured surroundings. The most frightening manifestation is the entity known locally as the matron, a tall, shadowy woman seen specifically looking into the reflective glass of parked cars near closing time, her expression one of utter, silent disapproval, as if inspecting living trespassers. To walk Oakland at twilight is to trespass not on merely hallowed ground, but on ground that fiercely refuses to be quiet. The dead here are crowded, forgotten, and fiercely protective of their eternal, miserable resting place, ensuring that silence is only ever an illusion maintained by the living. Sir Albert Pike Memorial Temple, Little Rock. The Little Rock Scottish Rite Temple, dedicated to the memory of Albert Pike, is not merely a structure of limestone and granite. It is an echoing repository of intent. The colossal edifice, with its intricate carvings and deliberate geometry, holds the cold, heavy stillness of a tomb. Even the daylight seems muffled upon entering the main auditorium, where tiers of silent red velvet seating ascend into shadow, waiting for a congregation that is long past. There is a palpable psychic weight to the air here, a consequence of centuries of intense ritual contained within the massive stone walls. The temple serves as a physical monument to Pike's esoteric legacy, a man whose purported spiritual ambition was as boundless as it was controversial. Legend claims that the intense, highly symbolic degrees performed within its walls, specifically in the rarely accessed third-floor chamber where the highest rites were conducted, have left behind more than just memories. They are energetic scars. Initiates and subsequent caretakers speak of a psychic bleed-through, where the emotional intensity of the most profound rituals remains trapped, creating a sort of spiritual feedback loop that draws the unwary into its persistent past. The most documented activity centers on the cavernous library stacks deep within the basement, where century-old texts emit a distinct, unnatural icy draft that defies the building's climate control. Researchers frequently report the sound of heavy, unseen shoes pacing above them on the main floor, sometimes accompanied by a dry, rasping cough emanating from the stacks themselves. Technicians reviewing surveillance footage have repeatedly observed fleeting, massive shadows darting between the stone pillars of the grand hall, always dissolving before they can be resolved, a movement too quick and too dark to be simply architectural anomaly. Objects frequently move in the ceremonial prop rooms, with heavy, antique swords found shifted 3 feet from their display mounts. But the deepest fear involves the realization that the building itself is not simply haunted by the anonymous dead, but controlled by a single, focused, deeply intelligent presence. Visitors often feel a crushing pressure behind their eyes when standing near the temple's numerous portraits of Pike, a sense of invasive scrutiny that lingers long after they leave the grounds. It is the chilling understanding that the profound secrets of the temple were never truly meant to be contained within the limestone and granite, but were always intended to observe the world outside, patiently waiting for a new vessel to carry on the work. Shisan? Robinson Center, Little Rock. The Robinson Center, dominating the Little Rock waterfront, carries the weight of nearly a century of performances, conventions, and civic life. Despite its gleaming modern renovations, the colossal auditorium still breathes the cold, expectant air of 1939. When the last crew leaves and the house lights dim, a residual energy settles over the empty seats, a faint, persistent hum that staff insist is not electrical. They often speak of the permanent audience, those who never truly left the hall, the most notorious lingering presence is associated not with the grand stage itself, but the vast, silent rigging above it. Legend holds that in the late 1940s, during a chaotic rehearsal, a young stagehand named Arthur met his end in the flyloft. He was reportedly tangled in the ropes of an old drop curtain and fell nearly 70 feet onto the stage floor. A gruesome incident that was quickly and quietly scrubbed from public record. Since that night, stagehands working the graveyard shift report unexplained movements in the immense darkness above the proscenium. Ropes sway without airflow, and heavy sandbags used for counterweights swing dangerously close to the catwalks, requiring the crew to sometimes halt operations entirely until the agitation ceases. Security logs frequently document anomalies beyond the loft. Elevators traveling to the administrative third floor, particularly near the old ballroom, often stop inexplicably between floors, the call buttons flickering wildly before settling back into silence. Down in the cold, concrete basement storage areas, corridors that predate the war maintenance workers have reported hearing distant, muffled applause echoing from the floor above, only to check the schedule and find the entire building securely empty. The sound, they say, is always slightly distorted, like a performance heard underwater. Perhaps the most chilling accounts come from solo cleaners tasked with polishing the main stage floor. They sometimes report seeing a momentary depression form in the dust near the center stage spot, a perfect, short-lived imprint of a kneeling man. It vanishes seconds later, suggesting Arthur is perpetually waiting for the curtain call he never took, doomed to watch the countless shows he can no longer operate. Schüssel, 10 Mile House, Little Rock. The structure known regionally as the 10 Mile House stands isolated off an unpaved service road near Little Rock, a decaying architectural footnote from the era of overland travel. Its location, precisely 10 miles from the territorial center, was once strategic, intended as a brief sanctuary. Today, the clapboard siding is silvered with neglect, and the deep, silent woods of central Arkansas press in around it, ensuring that any light reaching the parlor windows is filtered to a perpetual, sickly twilight. The atmosphere here is demonstrably heavy, a lingering physical density that seems to suppress natural sound. Documentation suggests the inn operated successfully for less than 7 years, closing abruptly around 1885. The official narrative details a rapid decline following a series of fatal gastrointestinal illnesses attributed to contaminated well water. However, regional folklore maintains that the closure was precipitated by a much darker cause involving the proprietress, Martha Llewellyn. Widowed and deeply fearful of isolation, Martha allegedly succumbed to a profound delusion. She began poisoning her overnight guests not for their valuables, but to ensure they never left her company. The resulting tableau, discovered by the county sheriff, featured 4 travelers seated permanently at the dining table, their deaths preserved by the chilling onset of a sudden December freeze. The ensuing century has solidified the location as a focal point for residual auditory phenomena. Researchers have consistently documented the unnerving sound of rhythmic, slow rocking coming from the empty parlor, often accompanied by a low, non-melodic humming that defies acoustic sourcing. More disturbing are the localized cold spots that radiate intensely from the dining room table, maintaining temperatures several degrees below ambient air. Regardless of the season, those who spend extended periods near this area often describe an acute, immediate sense of dread and an intense, invasive nausea, as if compelled to consume something profoundly unwholesome. The enduring myth posits that Martha Llewellyn achieved her desired companionship. Though the bodies were eventually removed, local tradition asserts that 5 permanent residents still occupy the 10 Mile House. They remain fixed 10 miles outside the city's sprawl, perpetual hosts waiting patiently for the next unwary traveler to finally stop for supper. 15, Dunbar Garden, Little Rock. The humidity hangs heavy over Plot 15 of Dunbar Garden, a place where the rich, dark soil of Little Rock seems to hold on to more than just nutrients. By day, the rows are orderly, tended by dedicated hands, but once the twilight shadows stretch, a peculiar, invasive stillness descends, a silence punctuated only by the distant traffic of I-630. It is a quiet that feels less like peace and more like a deliberate suppression, as if the ground itself is holding its breath over an ancient, unacknowledged secret deeply rooted beneath the manicured beds. Local lore suggests that before the area was repurposed as a community space in the late 1940s, it served as a secluded, overgrown section near the old Biddle Street drainage ditch. The most persistent legend concerns Alara Vance, a seamstress who disappeared suddenly in the autumn of 1943. While police records are sparse, neighborhood whispers maintain that her jealous fiancé murdered her and buried her somewhere beneath what is now the southernmost, perpetually failing asparagus patch. The rumor suggests the initial construction crews of the garden never excavated deep enough to disturb the clandestine grave, merely building the new, hopeful life of the garden directly over the old, violent end. The effect of this alleged history is chillingly consistent and localized. Gardeners report that during the full moon, the temperature over the asparagus patch can drop 15 degrees instantaneously, regardless of the August heat, often accompanied by the distinct scent of overturned earth where no soil has been touched. More alarmingly, staff who remain near the old root cellar have repeatedly documented distinct, repetitive sounds of scraping metal sounds, consistent with a shovel or trowel being dragged across rock emanating from the precise center of Plot 15. Even when the garden is demonstrably empty, these disturbances never escalate into full apparitions, but the subtle, relentless activity serves as a constant reminder that the soil is not barren, merely preoccupied. The ghost of Alara Vance is not looking for release. She is simply digging, perpetually trying to replant herself. That concludes our chilling countdown of Little Rock's top 15 haunted spots. We've confirmed Little Rock is truly a hub for the paranormal. If you survived this tour, hit the like button, share your own Arkansas ghost story below, and subscribe for more deep dives into the unknown. Thanks for watching.